Suffering is something that no one is immune from. Suffering comes in many different forms. For example, now we see people contracting the coronavirus in our country as well as around the world. They are suffering physically as well as emotionally. We also see people suffering spiritually in the midst of this pandemic. Well, what I want to do at this time is turn to St. Therese of Lisieux and learn from her how she dealt with her suffering.
St. Therese knew what it was like to suffer. She was only 4 years old when her mother died of a long illness. Her sister Pauline then helped to bring St. Therese up, but when St. Therese was 8, her sister left to become a nun. Once again, St. Therese felt alone and abandoned. Several years later, she became a nun herself, and yet shortly afterwards, her father became very ill, and St. Therese and her sisters worried greatly about him until he died. At the age of 23, St. Therese herself became seriously ill, being diagnosed with tuberculosis. In fact, it was the very illness that claimed her life. She spent over a year in gradual erosion of her bodily life. During her illness, she was always assailed by severe temptations to doubt her faith, especially the existence of heaven. A year after being diagnosed with tuberculosis, she died, and she was only 24 years old. St. Therese understood the sadness a person feels when someone they love is ill and then dies. She knew what it was like to feel lonely and to suffer from illness. Throughout her life, and particularly in her suffering, Teresa's trust in God was strong, even though she sometimes felt that God seemed far away. Before she died, she was able to look back at her life and see that God had been with her in her sadness and in her suffering. In her autobiography, St. Therese wrote, "I have experienced tribulations of all sorts and suffered a great deal. When I was a child, suffering used to make me sad. Now I taste its bitterness with joy and peace." Therese understood that suffering and sadness is a part of life. When she was sad, lonely, or ill, she asked God to help her in her pain. She said that suffering helps to make a person kinder towards others because it draws us closer to God. Because of this, Therese started to accept suffering happily because she recognized it was a gift from God to help her grow closer to God. Each time she suffered, she felt that she was sharing in Jesus' suffering in a very special way. And so, what can we learn from St. Therese? Well, life is a mixture of joy and sadness. Being a follower of Jesus doesn't mean we will never know pain or suffering. Instead, being a follower of Jesus helps us to understand the purpose of pain and sadness. Jesus showed how much God loves and cares for us through his suffering and his passion and death, and that God helps us when we too suffer ourselves. St. Therese believed that suffering helped her to grow closer to God, and she always asked God to help her in times of sadness and pain. Therese shows us that we too must trust in God's love for us. Even when things are difficult, we can ask God to give us strength we need to cope with our suffering.
When we choose to live by faith in difficult circumstances like now, rather than succumbing to the emotions of the moment, suffering can become an offering on behalf of the spiritual needs of our brothers and sisters around this world. See, when this happens, we realize, like St. Therese, the convergence of long suffering and prayer are two works of mercy that become so intimately connected. Stay spiritually strong, everybody.